Welcome to the Pennsylvania Historical Markers series. Thanks, everyone. So the Anthracite miners' strike of 1902, it began on May 12th and went to October 13th of 1902. And there are several dates within, because the actual coal miners themselves voted to go on strike on May 12th. I think the guys that were sort of outside and didn't actually have to go down in the mines, I think they started striking around June 2nd. And this was eastern Pennsylvania, so it was, Scranton area down through like Shenandoah and Pottsville and that region. It was over 100,000 people wound out striking ultimately. And it actually did go, like the physical strike ended the 13th, but I believe it went through the 23rd till they had mediations, and there was a commission afterwards, which we'll go into and talk a little bit. So there had been several strikes before in 1897, then 1899, and 1900, and it was strikes on different types of coal, because you had the anthracite is like a harder coal, and that was what's called the Anthracite miners' strike. There's also a softer coal and another type, I believe, as well, that they had in relation. And each of those strikes had resulted in certain concessions from primarily the coal operators were railroads that owned the rights to the coal mines and that type of stuff. So that's sort of what happened in that regard. But they had come to conclusion and some concessions in those previous strikes. One, because of William McKinley's election that was coming up, and I guess certain politicians got in the ear of the coal operators that if you don't make concessions, McKinley's not going to wind up winning. So, because if you look back in history, guys like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan really put a lot of money into McKinley so he would get elected. And part of the reason Teddy Roosevelt was put as vice president in the second term of McKinley is because they found Teddy Roosevelt to be a danger, and the vice presidency was considered political death. So that's why they happened. They never thought that McKinley would wind up ultimately getting assassinated, and then they'd wind up dealing with Teddy Roosevelt, which is what ultimately happened. But anyways, the workers were looking for an 8-hour workday, and they currently were working a 10-hour. They were looking for a 20% wage hike, and they were also looking for union recognition, which to this point, and even after this, the coal operators were still not willing to recognize the union's right to exist. Teddy Roosevelt and the federal government had to intercede ultimately, and this was the first labor dispute that the federal government was involved as a neutral arbitrator. Usually these things got solved or worked out between the coal operators and their thugs and then the workers, which usually was never fair unless there was a mitigating circumstance like I had given earlier, would have been one of those earlier strikes, 1900 most likely, that they either do and make concessions, or they wind up ultimately politically be in a much worse place. So some of the interesting stuff about the commissions I'll start talking about here, and some of the negotiations. So Teddy Roosevelt actually on June 8th, during his strike, went to his Commissioner of Labor, Carroll D. Wright, to investigate the strike. Wright investigated, he proposed reforms and acknowledged each side's position, but then politically they started to get a lot of pressure from the different sides that it would not be best, because Teddy Roosevelt wanted to step in, because the big problem with this strike is you were now going to have a coal shortage, and ironically they actually had a coal surplus, and with the coal surplus, the coal was not as valuable, and I think like the vast majority of the price of coal were the miners' wages, and so basically, the coal operators were actually okay with a prolonged strike, but Teddy Roosevelt had the foresight to see that if there was a coal shortage coming into winter, the big cities would ultimately suffer because they wouldn't get the coal supply that they needed, and people would freeze to death depending on the winter. So he felt that he needed to step in, but a lot of people in government said, you can't do this. If you do this, this is going to create major issues politically, which a lot of it was just vested interests in either side. And ultimately, he proposed to create a commission and that he would make sure that the miners' cause was shown to be just and that they would try to get some kind of resolution. Also, J.P. Morgan stepped in at that point as well. He had a vested interest in the Reading and Philadelphia Railroad, so he wanted to see this resolved as well, and he also understood what the ramifications of not getting this done. So ultimately, over time, they were able to come to a resolution and have that stop. They had a commission. I believe Teddy Roosevelt actually got Grover Cleveland to join that, who was the former president. And they were able to get the workers a 9-hour day, a 10% wage increase, but the union was still not recognized. So the union workers eventually said, okay, we'll take that. And with the commission, of course, the side of the coal operators made out that the miners were making up all, like they were living in great conditions, and all this was not that bad. They were very small circumstances, like here and there might have been a bad circumstance, but overall they were well taken care of, which was ridiculous, and everybody knew it was ridiculous. But ultimately, there were enough changes that there wasn't another strike until I believe the 1920s. But still, conditions were pretty bad. And this is one of the reasons we had done a earlier video on Mary Harris' Mother Jones. It's why she took up the cause of the coal workers, especially because they got abused horribly. And even with these concessions, like their lives were slightly better, but it was still one of those things that it still wasn't good. But there are props to Teddy Roosevelt because he really did try. But he was constrained to a degree by the politics of the time. It was a big machine. You have very powerful people like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, that they wanted to make sure that their interests were seen to first. And one of the excuses they gave too is like, well, most of the people don't even speak English, which how does that even remotely say, well, these people should live destitute and in horrible conditions? But that's just sort of how it was. But this was an extraordinary event. I want to say thank you to Colleen because she's the one that gave me a bunch of these pictures. And this historic marker is actually in Shenandoah, which is where some of the most violent strikes and protests happened, because they had accused the miners of killing like 21 people, which was not the case. But there was one where a guy got beaten to death. There was like 5,000 marchers and just stuff happened. And one of the other things interesting to note as well that I will say, Pennsylvania State Police was formed because of this. Because to this point, there were a police force called the Coal and Iron Police, but they were known to be horribly abusive and basically union busters. So I think until 1931, the Pennsylvania State Police and the Coal and Iron Police worked sort of in concert. But after that, that was completely finished. But I believe it was like, we're going to be doing a historic marker on the Pennsylvania State Police that talks specifically of why they were created by Governor Pennypacker. But it was in a way they didn't have to go as quickly to the National Guard, and the Pennsylvania State Police will be able to keep situations like this from getting out of control, and also from having abuses of the people. Because if there were any abuses in this, the majority were from the coal operator standpoint. It was a really pretty awful proceedings. But anyways, once again, I say thank you to Colleen. This is a viewer submitted video. She did the work with getting those original pictures, the color pictures you'll see on there of the monuments in Shenandoah to this event. and of the historic marker as well. So once again, thank you, Colleen. Thank you to everybody, and hope we get a little bit of information here. It's educational and entertaining, and we will see you all about town. I also want to mention that Colleen's Instagram is The Well Grounded Life. So check her out on Instagram. Thanks, everybody.